Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined this evening by two excellent guests. Firstly, by human rights activist Pinar Aksu. Pinar, how are you doing this evening?
I'm good, thanks. Yourself?
Excellent, thank you. And on the other side of me, we have the SNP's Shadow Foreign Affairs spokesman, Alan Smith. Alan, how are you doing today?
Anyway, I'm doing all right. There's plenty to be getting
Excellent.
on with, eh?
Good to hear. Well, we start as we always do with our coronavirus statistics update. And as of 2 pm today, a total of 482,194 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres. Of these, 462,273 were confirmed negative, 19,921 were positive. There were 44 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 today, but once again, there have been no new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. This will, of course, be an underestimate of the total number of cases, as not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not everyone will necessarily get tested. As we always do, we urge you, if you are showing symptoms at all, please do book a test as quickly as you can. Of the people who have tested positive, there were 243 people in hospital last night, one of whom was in intensive care. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection remains now at 2,492. This number only includes those who died in hospital having received a positive test for the virus. The latest UK daily figures available show that 41,449 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 16 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just those in hospitals. And as it's Tuesday, we also have the latest report from the Office for National Statistics for the week ending the 14th of August, which was week 33 of the year. For the first time since mid-June, the total number of deaths registered across England and Wales was higher than the 5-year average, although this does not appear to have been driven by the coronavirus pandemic. As in previous weeks, the total number of deaths in hospitals was below average, while deaths at home were significantly higher than the 5-year average. Deaths in care homes were also above the 5-year average for the first time in 9 weeks. In week 33, there were 139 deaths registered where the novel coronavirus was mentioned on the death certificate. 14 of those were in Wales, with the other 125 in England. There were 3 deaths registered in Scotland during that week. Once again, this is well below the UK government's daily tally for that week, which was 224. And before we go on to the rest of the news for today, I'll just remind you, if you want to join the conversation here, you can do so. Follow us first on Twitter at BroadcastScot, and then use the hashtag Scotland@7. That's hashtag ScotlandAT7. You will see some of those tweets flashing up on the screen throughout the show. But in our first story today, Mercy Baguma, a 34-year-old Ugandan asylum seeker, has been found dead next to her infant son at a flat in Govan on Glasgow's south side. Baguma had been working in the city until recently, when she lost her job after her limited leave to remain in the UK expired. She had been living in extreme poverty and was relying on friends and charities to buy food. The charity Positive Action on Housing reported that Baguma's 1-year-old son was suffering from malnutrition and required hospital treatment. The child is now said to be with his father, who also lives in Glasgow. A Police Scotland spokesperson said they are treating the death as unexplained, but not suspicious. And Pinar, I'll come to you first on this. This is just a horrible story. I mean, the third death of an asylum seeker or refugee that we've seen in Glasgow just in the last few weeks. How did you react when you heard this story today?
Well, I think, as you've said, it's the third life that has been lost, and this life could have been saved, and the whole situation was avoidable. When I heard the news today, as many people in Glasgow and within the organisations and groups, we were all very devastated to hear this sad news, especially at such a young age and to leave behind a baby. So I would say that the whole city of Glasgow at the moment is feeling the effects of this tragic news. And as you've mentioned, seeing deaths happening in the past few months has been really traumatizing for all the communities and for the asylum refugee, and I would say just across the city. I mean, the whole situation could have been avoided, as you've mentioned. The person, Mercy, when once her leave to remain had expired, she had to live in extreme poverty. And as a result, obviously now it's being investigated, but we have to remember that a life has been lost at the moment. As you remember, I was in this program last month discussing the death of Adnan, the Syrian refugee, who passed away in May in one of the hotels, which was being used by Mears as an accommodation place. And we had warned and we had raised our concerns, saying that if problems are not solved, if we don't have a better and humane asylum and immigration system in the UK, we are going to see such cases, and this is what has happened today.
Is this kind of thing common, where people lose their right to remain for whatever reason, and then are left in utter poverty, left without anything, relying on, as Mercy was, on charities just to survive?
Well, obviously, everyone's cases are different, and it depends on individuals claiming asylum, and if they had the student visa, then claiming asylum or refugee status. However, we are aware that there are many people who get given limited leave to remain. So what that could mean is they could have leave to remain for a year and a half, or 2 years, or 3 years, and they might have to reapply again. And it might be the case that people don't have the sources to reapply, or they have to then claim asylum again and wait for that. And there's a gap in between that a lot of people fall into destitution, or then there's no support. And obviously there's the whole issue around no recourse to public fund. I mean, the little baby was born here, and the little baby is a human life, and it should have the same right as every other child and baby in this country. But obviously there's a lot of issues around no recourse to public fund, and then it just people rely on charities and groups and neighbours and friends to survive. And I think during the pandemic, this is what we have clearly seen, that the injustices and how unfair the asylum and immigration system in this country is, that it pushes people into extreme poverty, and that they have to rely on so many other people. And today is another example of what has been happening. And it's quite upsetting to talk about this, because we see so many people who could potentially be in the same position and situation. And we do raise our concerns to say that this is avoidable, especially providing people some support, giving the advice that they need. And when this is not happening, we end up losing lives.
Yeah. Alan, if I could turn to you now. I was looking at the Foreign Office travel guidance for Uganda. At the moment, Uganda's borders are almost completely closed. Almost all flights have been suspended. And the FCO is recommending that people don't travel to Uganda right now. Even if Mercy had been ready to go, there's no real way she could have gone back to Uganda right now. Why do you think the UK government is willing to, do things like suspend evictions, because the COVID-19 pandemic has kind of changed the context, but is unwilling to show any sort of flexibility towards refugees and asylum seekers?
Well, it's just tragic altogether. And what happened to Mercy, my mate Chris Stevens, MP for the area in Glasgow where she was living, he had some dealings with his office. And what she shows is that we have got a dreadful situation in Scotland, which we're not entirely responsible for, but that's the point, that's the problem. We would not permit this to happen in our society if we had powers over this. What we're seeing with the lack of coordination between the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the UK government and the Home Office is, I'm afraid, all too typical. I mean, I've only been in Westminster since December, but it has staggered me the extent to which you've got different government departments operating almost entirely independently of each other. We've got the International Department for the International Development Department, which is being wound into the Foreign Office. We've got the International Trade Department, which is looking for guns and tanks and bombs contracts to the Saudi Arabian government, which is using them in Yemen. And then the foreign aid budget is mopping up with some of the consequences. It's appalling stuff. And it does shame us that this is happening within Scotland. This was a clearly very, very vulnerable individual who needed support, and she didn't get it. And I think all of us need to reflect on whether there's more that we could have done, and whether or not we need to agitate for better change, more devolution of powers. Obviously, I'm pro-independence. I want to see Scotland with all of these powers within a European framework so that we can share the load with our friends and allies. But this really should bring us all up short. This is yet another sign that the UK's policies aren't working for some of the most vulnerable people within our society.
And in Scotland, I mean, obviously things are not perfect, but we do have a Scottish government that is broadly pro-immigration and very sympathetic to refugees. The Labour Party, much the same. Even the Tories in Scotland are more sympathetic than what we see down south. But we're seeing at the same time this ramping up of rhetoric about an invasion coming across the Channel and so on. What do you think is the difference between Scotland and parts of England, certainly, in how that rhetoric, how that mentality develops?
You know, I've thought about this a lot over the last 3 years or so since the EU referendum, where Scotland was proven to have a very different attitude to freedom of movement, particularly. And I think it's partly our recent history. My family, we were almost £10 POMs, that we almost emigrated. Scotland, throughout its history, our tragedy has been that we've exported our people. So there's every single family in Scotland's got a cousin in Canada, an uncle in Australia, relatives in the States, whatever it might be. Even just sending a Bruins annual every Christmas to go and to them, that's not an unusual folk experience for us. So the idea that people are paying us the supreme compliment of coming to Scotland, with all our dreadful weather, as we've seen lately, just today, right? Why would anybody want to live here, including us? The fact that anybody's coming is fantastic. We need more people. There is a cross-party unity on that, where in a way that, frankly, the UK as a whole has a different kind of dynamic. And this idea that people getting into boats to cross the Channel into the south coast of England, that is an act of desperation. No person who has better options would do that. And the idea that these people can be castigated as economic migrants, as if that's a bad thing, is just so deeply, deeply damaging to the UK's credibility internationally. But the UK is in trouble just now. Look at this absolutely bogus culture war nonsense about last night at the proms, that dreadful thing which I've never watched in 20 odd years, the not singing Land of Hope and Glory, and the people who are getting excited about that, but they weren't that excited about what I would suggest would be considerably more significant things. That there really is an agenda to distract people with bread and circuses and castigating other people as others who are not from round here, so not one of us. And I'm glad that in Scotland we do less of that. We're not immune. That's why I think it's really important for politicians like me to be vocal in our support for immigration, a humane asylum process. Now, an independent Scotland will have an immigration and nationality policy, and we'll need to be tough at times as well. But geez, we can only improve on what the UK is doing just now.
Yeah, it always strikes me that rule Britannia, we can't very well claim to rule the waves if we're threatened by an invasion of people in rubber dinghies. We do obviously send our best wishes to the family and friends of Mercy. We hope that they can find some peace sometime soon. But we move on now. And back to Scotland, guidance for pupils and staff on the use of face coverings in schools and on school transport has been updated. In light of the latest scientific and public health advice, including WHO guidelines, face coverings should now normally be worn in secondary schools by adults and all pupils moving around the school, such as in corridors and communal areas where physical distancing is difficult to maintain, and on dedicated school transport by all children aged 5 or over, bringing it into line with guidance for other public transport. While staff and students can continue to wear face coverings if they wish to, face coverings will not generally be necessary in the classroom, as there is greater scope for physical distancing and face coverings can have an impact on learning and teaching. However, it remains the case that where adults cannot keep 2 metres distance and are interacting face to face for a sustained period of 15 minutes or more, face coverings should be worn. And Alan, there's been some kind of debate about this. We've seen some people saying that this is a gross, invasion of or gross violation of people's civil liberties. But at the same time, we're seeing young people told that when they're outside school, they have to be physically distanced. They have to wear masks at all times, and yet in the classroom, they're not wearing masks, and in some cases, seem to be encouraged not to wear them where it's a voluntary thing. What's your take on this change in policy from the Scottish Government?
Well, it's not the first change in policy, and it's not going to be the last. I'll let you into a secret. This is evolving fast. Our understanding of the transmission of the viruses, the disease, is evolving fast as well. One of my favourite examples of how some things can be counterintuitive, the ban for the moment on music in pubs. That's there because, and it was explained to me because I didn't quite understand it either, but it was explained to me as well. One of the risks of transmission, remember, this is if it's in your body, the way it gets out is through your breath, effectively, and touching things. But if you're shouting over loud music, your breath goes that much further. So the risk becomes that much higher to those around you. So we've decided collectively that indoors in pubs, we don't need masks so long as everybody's sitting at tables and not moving around. You do need a mask otherwise, and we're seeing this in schools as well, that maintaining the best approach to the risk factors in this. When you're sitting in a classroom, you're at your desk, so you're not moving around. So your germs aren't moving around. Germs is the wrong word, but the disease isn't moving around with you. Whereas if you're in communal areas, then you probably are. So you should be wearing a mask. So this is evolving. And we've been saying long since that stay home, stay isolated, stay in lockdown. That was a really simple, easy message to understand. It is becoming more complex. It is becoming more nuanced. And we need to really cockany with this. And schools, of course, are going to be one of the places where the advice is going to evolve as the situation evolves as well. We're not unique in this. Every other country in the world is having to deal with this, and we're doing what we're doing on the basis of the best science and the precautionary principle to keep the risks as low as possible, because we do have things under control. We need to make sure it stays that way.
Yeah. And Pinar, obviously, young people don't always listen to the advice of their parents, their government, whatever. Do you think kids will be ready to accept this advice and will be fairly willing to wear their masks where they're supposed to?
Well, I think, to be honest with you, I think the idea of wearing masks should have been at the very beginning when the schools have opened. I just feel like at the moment it's a little late already, when students have been in the classes and when also the teachers have been exposed amongst so many students. I have few teacher friends who's actually are really concerned about the whole situation. We do obviously know that and expect students to sit down and stay still in the classroom. However, if you're talking about a first year up until third year, they would be running around and they might be coming close up to the teacher. So we also need to think about the teachers as well. We've seen what happened in Dundee, that there was the news of 17 teachers having the virus. So I just feel like at the moment, the idea of wearing the mask while transitioning from one class to another is a good step. However, it should have been in place at the very start, and actually all the students should be wearing the mask inside the classroom as well. And this is not just me who actually works from home, but just hearing from my friends who are all teachers. This is their greatest concern. Also, when you look at 4th, 5th and 6th years, they are 16, 17, 18-year-olds who actually go out especially the 18-year-olds who do go to pubs and different places and meet a lot of people. And when they come to classrooms, they are not expected to wear the mask. So obviously that exposes a great danger for the teachers, who then goes home to their families. So there's actually a great risk of spreading the virus again. And I think that, to be honest with you, I would expect that everybody wearing the mask at this stage, rather than during when you go between, changing between the period of the classes.
Yeah, yeah. It is obviously a voluntary thing in classes. So, yeah, if you want to take Pinar's advice, I think I would probably agree. We move on now, though, and people who suspect that they may have coronavirus will be able to receive a test at a walk-through testing centre. The clinically approved and risk-assessed model means people can access testing in semi-permanent centres, indoors and outdoors, just days after a site has been agreed. Work has begun to set up the first of 11 sites planned to be up and running before winter. Appointments will be available through NHS Inform to students and the wider community for the first of these to be housed in the Victory Memorial Hall in St Andrews. Testing is expected to commence at this site in the coming days. Consideration of location of the further 10 sites, which will be easily accessible by bike or on foot, is underway, including in the Highlands, in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And Pinar, I'll come back to you on this now. Is this, do you think, going to make it much easier for people to get access to testing?
I would say for some people, however, for some people, maybe not that easy, especially if people who doesn't have access to internet or who don't have access to, the digital phone or laptops. What we've been hearing actually amongst the asylum and refugee community is we did have a case where somebody tried to book online test for COVID-19, and they were actually being asked for their national insurance number. However, when you're seeking asylum, obviously you don't have your national insurance number, so this creates a huge problem for people. And this pandemic, affects anyone. It doesn't matter of your legal status. So I would be actually interested to find out how they would be willing to solve this issue. Does that mean some lives are more important than others? Because if you are seeking asylum or refuge, or if you actually don't have access to internet or technology, then how are you going to be able to proceed with getting a test?
Well, Alan, I'll ask you about that. What do you make of that problem that some of Pinar's friends have been experiencing?
Well, I'm concerned to hear that, and I'd ask Pinar, I'd ask anybody to drop me a line if there are any difficulties with accessing treatment. I mean, we're building a system from scratch, and we're doing well with what we've got. We're beefing up the capacity. Obviously, the disease can be in any person, wherever they're from, whoever they are. So everybody needs to be part of this system, part of this effort. And there's different ways of being referred into the system, of course. It doesn't need to just be through the internet. But these new walk-in centres, I think we've got high hopes for them. This is beefing up the capacity. We've got to make getting tests as easy as possible. And of course, we've got the whole of the NHS. The whole network is referring people into this. So we're building it as we're going along, of course, but there's been a good response, and we're not going to get everything right all the time, but where there are teething troubles, let's make sure that we fix them. And the lack of a national insurance number won't stop anybody getting a test. I'm quite sure of that.
Okay, well, we will possibly discuss that after the show and figure out exactly how we can make that happen. But we move on now, and an overwhelming majority of voters believe the Scottish Government should have the power to borrow money on its own terms, according to a YouGov poll. The latest survey from YouGov also found that voters in Scotland think the UK government should maintain its current spending levels to support the economy, even if that means more borrowing. Of those polled between the 6th and the 10th of August who expressed an opinion, 69% believe the Scottish Government should have the power to borrow money. 71% believe borrowing should be used to maintain spending that supports the economy and public services, even if it means a larger national debt. And 62% prefer the deficit being reduced via taxation instead of by cuts. Despite this, the Tory Chancellor at Westminster plans to end the furlough scheme prematurely in October, posing a huge threat to the viability of many jobs and businesses across Scotland. Pinar, this is something that we've discussed on the show many times. Do you think there's any? Did these numbers surprise you?
Actually, no, because I mean, what Alan has been mentioning there, if there was an independent Scotland, obviously there would be more power to make our own decisions. So actually, it doesn't surprise me.
And Alan, I'll come to you just quickly. Is there any movement from the UK government on any of these issues, either extending the furlough scheme in any way, even to on a sectoral basis perhaps, or the big one of actually transferring some kind of borrowing powers to the Scottish Parliament?
I think there's movement on all sorts of things, and what we're seeing, and to be fair to the UK government, as I always try to be, I mean, I'm a Nat, I want to see an independent Scotland, but let's try and be fair. The creation of the furlough scheme was big. It was very big. It was very quickly done. So it was always going to need refined. Now, I've got, and obviously representing Stirling, an awful lot of businesses that have seasonality at their heart, and tourism businesses in particular. They were just coming out of the winter. They'd just invested to get things ready. And then the lockdown happened. So we're in danger of 3 winters in a row, which is going to wipe out a lot of otherwise very, very lucrative businesses. And that's because the cash flow is just gummed up entirely because interest rates were so low. We've seen a lot of businesses not carrying cash reserves because there was no great incentive to, and taking on more debt than they're able to cope with now because debt rates were cheap. So I've long said that the furlough scheme should have been more limited in terms of people it was covering, but extended. So I think that's an eminently sensible proposition. I still think it is. The UK government desperately wants to declare mission accomplished. That's us all out of it now, guys. We're all okay. And that's just not going to be where we're going to be. The reality of the UK government's package is that it does need to be extended much further. I take great issue, and having said I've been fair to the UK government, I'll be fairly very critical of them right now, that one of the biggest ticket items that the Chancellor announced was a stamp duty holiday for house purchases, which is a ruinous waste of money for people who don't need it. You're not going to buy a house or otherwise because stamp duty's on holiday or otherwise. It's a ruinous bung to the middle classes, while we're seeing a lot of companies, a lot of self-employed people, a lot of seasonal businesses really be the lifeblood, the entrepreneurial lifeblood of Scotland's and the UK's economy being absolutely ignored by the support schemes that have been delivered. And we need better. And if the UK government is borrowing on our behalf in Scotland, because that's the constitutional setup right now, and I will push for borrowing powers. There's a very good report just come out from the Scottish Parliament, my old mate Bruce Crawford, MSP for Stirling's committee, where it's quite clear that if the UK government will not borrow on our behalf for us to look after our economy as we know best, then the powers need to be devolved. And there's a very lively discussion there, and I'm engaging with that to try and get as much sense into the system as possible, because it's quite clear we're far from out the woods on the pandemic yet, and the health aspects are becoming an economic crisis as well. And my priority is jobs and jobs and jobs. We've got to support people through this.
Well, we move on now, and this is one of the stories that's the big reason we've got Alan Smith on tonight, because the SNP's Shadow Foreign Secretary has called on the UK government to show ambition and total commitment to tackling genocide and human rights atrocities around the world on the 3rd anniversary of the Rohingya crisis. Today marks 3 years since the outbreak of the conflict in western Myanmar's Rakhine state that drove hundreds of thousands of Rohingya Muslims from their homes. It's estimated that up to 3/4 of the Rohingya people are today living outside of Myanmar, and the UNHCR have registered over 860,000 refugees in the settlements in Cox's Bazar. Alan Smith MP has written to the Foreign Secretary, has said that the international community must not only maintain support for refugees and their host communities, but adapt to changing needs and do more to find solutions to conflict, including in the cases of Yemen and Xinjiang. The UK government still gives billions of pounds worth of arms support to regimes such as Saudi Arabia, which is continuing to wage a devastating war in Yemen, which the UN says has left them directly accountable for inflicting tens of thousands of civilian casualties. And Alan, this obviously is an issue that matters a lot to you. This 860,000 people displaced, and it's been going on for 3 years, and there's been very little progress in resolving the situation. What would you like to see the UK government and perhaps the wider international community do to resolve that situation?
Well, there's a real concern that 3 years into the conflict that it becomes stuck. and we see people just stuck in refugee camps, forever dependent upon the international community and the aid agencies. And actually, what we've done is taken the pressure off the Burmese government, and they conducted ethnic cleansing. They conducted an atrocity, and there needs to be consequences for that. And refugees don't want to be refugees. Refugees want to go home. So this is one of the things where I want to see, and I'm calling on the UK today, on the anniversary, to step up its efforts, not just to deal with the humanitarian consequences of the situation. And I very much support the fact that the UK, the EU, the US even, is putting considerable resource to help the Bangladeshi government cope with this situation, because they've got best part of 1 million people turned up in one of the bits of the country that is least equipped to deal with it. But treating the humanitarian symptoms will only take us so far. There needs to be a proper negotiated peace, and the international community is good at some of this stuff sometimes, but more often than not, it's really just better at turning a blind eye and treating the symptoms. So we're also proposing, as well as a serious dialogue, and if that involves stepping up sanctions, Magnitsky-style sanctions on individuals in the regime, targeted other interventions, well, we need to have everything on the table. But what we're also calling for is that the UK, as part of its integrated foreign and defence review, should implement an atrocity policy, which will unite the intelligence that we have with other countries, and the EU is making steps in this direction as well, to deal with, before they happen, the consequences of ethnic cleansing, that ameliorate that situation, calm things down, like what we're seeing in Syria at the moment, where Syria seems to be gearing up for an offensive on the Kurds in Syrian, nominally Syrian territory. We're seeing as well that the Turks seem to be stepping up engagements as well. And the international community can do so much more to help with the build-up, or alleviating the build-up to these situations, so that we're not dealing with humanitarian disasters. And as we've seen in Bangladesh, as we've seen in Burma, we're just not seeing the international community doing what it can to avoid the conflict.
Pinar, I'll come to you on this. These 860,000 displaced people, mostly in Bangladesh, it does kind of highlight that the handful of people coming across the channel are the very thin end of the wedge of the refugee crisis that's happening in other parts of the world. We see millions of Syrians in Jordan and internally displaced as well. We see these 860,000 Rohingya people. Why do you think we're so kind of detached from these crises when they're so far away from us?
Just to say that in agreement what Alan has been saying, the international community, first of all, needs to be prepared and have the implementations in place when such incidents take place. And I would say that the UK is probably not so detached, especially when you look at the Middle East and so many other countries, and the reasons why the wars have been starting in the first place. As it's been mentioned, the issue of arming groups or arming some certain groups which create for people to seek asylum and refuge. And on the issue of the protection, that's why we have the refugee protection. That's why we have the United Nations and the European Union, who are meant to be creating legal and safe pathway for people to seek asylum and refuge. However, at the moment, this is not what actually we are seeing in reality and on the ground. When we have people crossing the channel to come here, what Priti Patel has actually done is to put unaccompanied refugee children into detention centres, actually, instead of providing them the support that they need, whether this is in accommodation or in a hotel. However, that they have placed the children refugees into detention centres, although this has been said to be temporary, but we never know. And obviously, looking at the record of the immigration system and the Home Office in the UK, it creates the issues around lack of trust and whether this will actually happen or not. I mean, what Alan was saying earlier about the concept of people looking into refugees coming in the country, and the ideology of that we have millions of asylum seekers and refugees. And this is the tool that some politicians create, and the media that uses, when actually we have serious issues and concerns that we should be talking about, such as the deaths around COVID-19, which could have been avoidable if the government took a firm action at the very beginning of the pandemic. Instead, we're talking about such cases of millions of refugees coming to the country, which in itself is not right, and it's the racist and divisive language that the media always uses.
Mm. And Alan, you mentioned also in this letter cases like Saudi Arabia, where the UK is heavily involved in the arms trade, those weapons then being used in Yemen, which has created another refugee crisis. What can the UK government do, and or perhaps why isn't the UK government more ethical, I guess, in the way it allows arms sales to work?
Well, it's power politics, it's economics, it's money. Scotland is an arms producer as well. We've got lots of arms producers which are creating top-end engineering jobs, and that's something that we need to get real about as well. And independent Scotland will have this issue to think about too. Where I'm suggesting that we can do things differently is let's take a look at how Belgium does it, for example. Belgium has an arms industry, but the Belgian Parliament, a politically independent committee of the Belgian Parliament will actually do a report into each proposed arms sale. So they can have a proper ventilation about, well, who are these going to? What are they likely to be used for? Is this the sort of business we as a society want to be engaged in? And it's legitimate for us to decide that we do. And this is where I'm not a pacifist. I do think that we do need to engage in the real world as it is. Scotland is an aspiring international state. We're not an aspiring Amnesty International. We're going to have to make tough decisions here too. But there are ways that we could put checks and balances into the UK right now, where there are political will to do it, and there's ways that we can do that as an independent Scotland, and that's the work that I'm engaged in. But when it comes to the arms trade, there's more double standards than purity in a lot of this, and the simple fact is sending arms as we are to the Saudi government as it is right now. Now, I'm really close to Saudi. I grew up in Riyadh a million years ago, but I'm close to the Middle East. I'm a friend of the Middle East. And exactly as Pina said earlier, the UK and France particularly are enmeshed in the history of how the problems of the Middle East came to be the way they are at the moment. And we're bound to the people in the Middle East in terms of where the boundaries have been laid and the legacy of colonialism, all of that stuff. And there's no problem in the world that is improved by sending guns and tanks and bombs at it. And the UK really does do a lot of good humanitarian work. I'd pay tribute to that. But the UK also causes the need for a lot of humanitarian work to be done. And we need to have a proper discussion about the other end of the spectrum there as well.
Mm. Well, we move to another country having its troubles just now. Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has told the European Parliament that the movement for democratic reform in the country will not stop, despite two of her allies being arrested. Speaking from her self-imposed exile in Lithuania, Tikhanovskaya said the authorities had responded with threats and intimidation to the Coordination Council, set up by the opposition to bring about non-violent change. But she insisted the intimidation didn't work. We will not relent. We demand to respect our basic rights. We demand all political prisoners be free. Protests have entered a third week following the disputed presidential election in which Alexander Lukashenko, known as Europe's last dictator, claims to have won 80% of the vote. Action is being coordinated by a 7-person council, but yesterday strike leader Sergei Bilevsky and Tikhanovskaya's political aide Olga Kovalkova were arrested, while a third member of the council, Nobel Prize-winning writer Svetlana Alexievich, was summoned for questioning. Bilevsky was sentenced to 10 days in prison earlier today. And Alan, I'll come to you on this one as well. Dominic Raab has said that further sanctions are going to be imposed, but we were just informed earlier today by our good friend Dr. Alan Flowers that there is an ongoing military collaboration between the MOD and the Belarusian armed forces. Is that something that's appropriate when we know that the military in that country is being used in part to suppress democratic protest?
Well, I don't think it's appropriate, but I certainly don't think it's unusual. The UK has military cooperation with a number of regimes in a number of places where I think we do need to have a lot more scrutiny of what actually goes on and who we're supporting there. I've yet to properly speak to Alan Flowers to get his insight to what the story is there, but that's something I will look to take up at Westminster if that's happening. I have to say, given the extent to which Belarus is in the Russian sphere of influence and relations with Russia really are in the deep freezer at the moment, militarily, I think there's shades of grey in that one, which I want to explore better yet. But no, certainly the UK needs to look at Magnitsky-style sanctions targeted on the regime, not to harm the general population. But I was really struck, and I actually watched the European Parliament Foreign Affairs Committee, my old committee, hearing from her, and we need to be really careful not to write checks that we're not able to cash. And we saw this from the European Parliament in the first Maidan protests in Kiev, and there was a backlash to that. I remember Guy Verhofstadt saying, "We will never abandon you, we will never abandon you." The tanks rolled in and they did abandon them. And we need to be really nuanced in our support for Belarusian democracy and journalists. We need to make sure that there will be consequences on the regime individually by the people who are actually perpetrating these abuses. But we do need to tread very, very gently in this, because this is Europe's last dictatorship, if we're not counting Russia as one. But we need to be very, very careful in supporting the democracy, but being realistic about the consequences of where things might go next. It's a very complicated.
And Pinar, what's been your reaction to seeing these these protests sustained over 3 weeks? People have been arrested. A couple of protesters have been killed. Do you get the feeling watching this that there is change on the horizon?
I mean, as it's been said, it's really sad to see that this is what people have to go through, and this is what people have to do to just have their basic right of having an election and deciding for the future of their country. And yes, it's what's been happening for the ordinary people who actually just wants to raise their voice is actually something that we see across the world. And this is what happens when the people in power knows that they are going to lose their seat and change will arrive. And this is sadly the method that is being used on the ordinary people and for the people. I mean, just to relate it back to UK, even the term democracy means in itself is very interesting, and we should actually be looking at the term democracy within this country. I mean, we've been having prime minister for the last recent elections. I mean, did we actually have a democratic election? Was the whole process even? And when you even look at the whole process of having an independence, for the referendum, was that a democratic decision for ourselves? I mean, the way that the media had portrayed certain stories and issues leading up to the referendum in itself has been shocking. So I think the whole concept of democracy in itself is very interesting, and obviously each country sees and defines it differently. But if we had to relate back to Scotland and to UK, we've got a lot of work to do ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. We move a little bit further east now, and the Kremlin has rejected accusations that Vladimir Putin was involved in the suspected poisoning of opposition critic Alexei Navalny, who is in a coma in a German hospital. A spokesman called reports of his poisoning hasty in the Kremlin's first remarks since the Berlin clinic where Navalny is a patient confirmed that he had been contaminated with a cholinesterase inhibitor, part of a group of chemicals that includes nerve agents and pesticides, as well as certain drugs. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, said today that accusations against Putin over the poisoning were empty noise and idle talk. "We can't treat as serious the accusations you've voiced," Peskov said during a conference call with journalists. "These accusations can in no way be true." In his remarks, Peskov said that no criminal investigation would be opened in Russia unless doctors identified the specific substance with which Navalny had been poisoned, suggesting it would stonewall such a move. Doctors at the Berlin hospital treating Navalny have been unable to identify the specific substance used. Navalny's allies believe part of the reason for the delay in getting him out of Russia was down to state actors wanting to allow time for the poison to become undetectable in his system. Alan, we know that the Russian government, or Putin's people, are willing and able to poison people even outside the borders of Russia. It is obviously possible that this was some other actor, but it all kind of boils down to the fact that the rule of law in Russia is almost completely absent. How concerned are you about this kind of thing happening?
I'm very concerned, and remember, the goal of Russian propaganda is to persuade you that nothing is true and everything is possible. So this is firing nonsense into the debate, chaff into the discussion. They have a deeply sophisticated network of propaganda with Russia Today, Sputnik News, the rest of them just firing things out. The idea that my enemy's enemy is my friend, so therefore they're on our side. It's a deeply, deeply dangerous regime. And I say that as a friend of Russia. I've got a lot of Russian pals. I studied in Poland, and I've got friends here who are Russian. And politics is a thing that they've just backed out of, sadly. But there's no question that the Russian regime has proven that it uses these kind of tactics before. I don't think evidence does yet exist to target anybody. It's still very much being worked on in the Berlin clinic, and the German authorities are on top of that. So I think we need to be cautious about who did it, why it was done. This is murky stuff, and it could be oligarch versus oligarch. There could be a falling out amongst who knows who. But Navalny has been a very principled, very hard-working champion for democracy, and therefore critic of the Putin regime. So it's obvious he was a target, and cui bono, who benefits from him being attacked? Well, obviously it's the regime itself. So again, I'm back to my point about the UK government is in a position now, we have Magnitsky-style sanctions to implement them, and to implement them on people who are proven to be part of this. I wouldn't regard many Russian investigations into this as greatly credible in terms of finding the right people or otherwise, but the EU is acting on this via the German authorities, and the UK needs to be closely associated with that because we face a common problem.
Mm-hmm. And Pinar, Russia obviously isn't the only country that engages in this kind of behaviour. What would you like to see the UK and perhaps the EU doing about countries that are engaged in this kind of assassination of political opponents?
I think initially, instead of looking at UK, I would say that maybe globally, and looking at human rights organisations, it should be condemned for such actions to be used. And as Alan had been mentioning, if there is going to be new platform and new opportunities to engage in such dialogues, or to investigate and have to prevent such things or to condemn it, I think that's one step forward. However, I would say there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and a lot of actually burden on the human rights organisations, who ends up obviously defending the rights of people and peaceful protesters.
Well, we go to the other side of the Atlantic now, and the Republican National Convention began last night with President Trump, his son Donald Jr., and others making memorable, melodramatic speeches warning of a threat to America's way of life if Democratic nominee Joe Biden wins the election in November. Trump formally accepted the party's nomination without opposition before claiming that Democrats were trying to steal the election. Trump has spent a lot of time recently trying to undermine confidence in postal voting, which is a popular idea while the coronavirus pandemic is ongoing and is thought to favour Democrats. They want to destroy this country and everything that we have fought for and hold dear, Trump campaign advisor Kimberly Guilfoyle said. They want to steal your liberty, your freedom. They want to control what you see and think and believe so they can control how you live. Donald Trump Jr., the president's oldest son and Guilfoyle's boyfriend, portrayed the ongoing civil unrest as violent assaults on small businesses by anarchists and said Democrats would fail to keep neighborhoods safe. Pinar, do you think that Joe Biden is going to lead a far left anarchist revolution in the US?
I think that would be a huge claim to make. However, as long as I would say at this stage that Trump is taken out from power, it would just benefit the whole country. I mean, the person himself is just a joke to the world, I think, and it's really worrying that such people end up being the leaders of which are considered to be, US is meant to be considered to be one of the strongest and powerful country in the world, and we are not so much far from that in the UK. We've got Boris Johnson, which is another joke in itself, leading a country, and not well. Leading a country in itself is questionable, but it's really worrying. And I think at this stage, the people of America are suffering. They're the ones who are paying for having such a president at the moment. And when you look at the way that they have handled the whole pandemic, again, it's not much different to UK. So many lives have been lost. And I would say at this stage, as long as Trump leaves his seat and somebody else comes. And obviously it doesn't mean that the other person who comes along is going to be a great person. Again, it raises lots of questions and concerns about their policies and politics as well. But just to highlight again, having Boris Johnson and Donald Trump leading US and UK is just an absolute one of the jokes that we have witnessed in this century, I think.
And Alan, Trump has consistently for the last few months tried to undermine confidence in the election. He talked about moving the election, even though he doesn't have the power to do that. He's told people that postal voting can't be trusted. There are allegations that he's deliberately tried to cause the postal service to kind of be unable to manage that process. What do you think he's trying to do? I mean, some people think his goal is to undermine faith in the election so much that he'll just be able to squat in the White House and not be able to be removed. Do you think that's a realistic concern?
I think it's more than realistic. I think we see the evidence of it on an almost hourly basis at the moment. So the Republican National Convention, where half of the keynote speakers had the surname Trump. I mean, Kim Jong-un would be embarrassed by those sorts of tactics. It's a dreadful, dreadful situation for a friend of Scotland to be in. The US is a fantastic country. I've got my sister, brother-in-law and the babies live in California. I've got relatives in New Jersey as well. Like many Scots, were closely connected to the US. And it's in trouble. And it's been in trouble for a long time. It's a deeply unequal society. It's a deeply uneven society. They've got ruinously expensive healthcare, which is beyond the reach of lots of folks. So that gives an instability, a precariousness to the economic situation, which a lot of people have as well, because they're in a gig economy. They're working hard to stay even remotely ahead, and they're not. So that creates a lot of anger. That creates a lot of angst. We've got deep racial inequality as well, which has exploded recently with the Black Lives Matter movement pushing back against racial injustice. And there's a cocktail of unease. There's a cocktail of angst. And that's what Trump is building upon. This is the billionaire white guy who pretends that he's the outsider. This is deeply dishonest stuff. And what he's been saying for the best part of a year now is that democracy can't actually be trusted. Your vote's not going to be properly done. And remember, there's some people in Scotland say that postal votes can't be trusted, and they're absolutely wrong. Our postal voting system is utterly with integrity. Our voting system is with integrity. The people who are in charge of Scotland's voting system are absolutely straight down the line. And we need to defend democracy as an idea and also in practice, because baddies like Trump and other people in other places are trying to undermine it. But yeah, we see this regularly, that he is trying to discredit the process. And they doubtless don't ever dismiss Trump as just a stupid blowhard. There's a strategy to what he's doing. He is trying to poison the well and hopefully, from his perspective, emerge as the last person standing. And I really hope the Democrats are up for a scrap, because this is going to be a scrap.
Well, we come back to Scotland now, and Scottish Government funding for students in higher education rose to more than £1 billion in the last academic year, according to figures from the Student Awards Agency Scotland. Within that total, awards of non-repayable bursaries and grants for full-time students rose by 10.8%. The latest numbers show that 148,570 full-time undergraduate and postgraduate students, 20,030 part-time students and 9,580 nursing and midwifery students were supported through the SAAS in the form of a bursary, grant, fees or a loan. The total support provided increased by 2.8% from $981.6 million in 2018-19 to $1.009 billion in 2019-20. Average support per full-time student was £6,140, an increase from £6,010 in the previous session, with the overall amount provided in non-repayable bursaries and grants increasing from £80.2 million in 2018-19 to £90.9 million last year. And we are quite short of time, so I'll just jump straight onto our last story. And Finance Secretary Kate Forbes has welcomed recommendations for developing a world-class technology sector in Scotland. Recognising the sector's potential for innovation and high growth, a report from entrepreneur Mark Logan outlines ways of creating more jobs, increasing investment in Scottish startups and improving computing science education. Mr. Logan, who helped the flight comparison site Skyscanner gain a market value of over $1.5 billion during his time as Chief Operating Officer, has made 34 recommendations, including creating a national network of hubs for tech startups, establishing a new fund to make strategic investments in the Scottish tech sector, and providing more software engineering courses for those looking to change careers into the sector. Pinar, do you think this is a good strategy for building up a high-tech sector in Scotland?
Although I don't have much knowledge about it and how it's going to be developed, however, I think it's a positive move to have developments within the country, just to raise the issue around again who would be benefiting from it, and whether this would create new job opportunities or it would be just another way of making more money. I mean, there's serious questions around that. Just to comment on the previous news around the funding towards education for the students. I'd just like to raise a small concern and issue around this. Today I had spent a few hours actually trying to help a member of our community centre. And just to brief it up, basically it's a person who wants to study at college seeking asylum, and obviously you cannot study full time. And this person wanted to do a nurse course, and we were talking about education, the boost of support for students. Sadly, because of not having right to work, during her placement, she had to do a placement within NHS. Although she would not be working, there's a huge barrier of lack of knowledge, I would say, within the admission of whether this person would be working or not. And as a result, she had to change the course, and she was actually directed to studying a lower course than what she had already done. So I think it raises again, which I would be happy to chat with Alan about it, or relevant person, about the devolved powers that we have in Scotland, and what could be achieved and what could be done for people in our communities who actually wants to contribute to economy, who actually wants to contribute in different fields of workplaces.
Yeah, that does sound important. And Alan, just very quickly, your thoughts on these last two stories?
Well, the student support is Scottish Government continuing to put our money where our mouth is. We need to invest in the next generation. I take Pinar's points, and if there's something I can do to help with that, as a Westminster MP, it's a Home Office rule again, so point it my way. Equally on the Logan report, I'll confess I've not read it, but we'll certainly going to get it printed out to have a good read at. But the IT sector in Scotland, here's a statistic to close with, already right now today employs more people than mining did at the height of the mining industry in Scotland. So we've already got a flourishing tech sector in Scotland. We've already got a lot of good stuff. What the Logan Report's about, and he's a serious person who did some great stuff in the industry, is what's the next punch through? What's the next thing we need to do? So I'm looking forward to reading it, and it's great the Scottish Government's commissioning that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Well, that is an excellent place to leave it. We thank, obviously, Pinar and Alan for joining us. It's been a real pleasure talking to both of you. And we thank you at home for joining us as well. There wouldn't be any point in making these shows if you weren't with us. We do have to ask, if you're able to support us, then please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register, sign up there as a supporter, and your £5 a month can help us to keep developing to become the kind of broadcaster that Scotland deserves. If you're not able to support us financially, we do absolutely understand. Don't worry, the shows will always be free to view online, but you can still make a big difference by following us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot, finding us on Facebook and liking the page there. Also finding our YouTube channel and subscribing there, and also clicking the bell icon to make sure you're updated when a new show is on. And that helps us. You can then spread the word about Broadcasting Scotland, be our marketing team, because we don't have a lot of money to spend on marketing. And finally, if you'd like to get involved here, we've mentioned a few times recently that we've been short-staffed on a couple of shows. It's very difficult to run these shows with only one person behind the scenes, which is what we've had to do a few times recently. We'd love to have more people helping out. So if you're interested at all in getting involved, do please get in touch with us. We would love to hear from you. We know many hands make light work, so please do come and get involved. But that is all we have time for tonight. I'll be back again tomorrow with another Scotland at 7. I believe we're talking to Drew Hendry MP tomorrow because, of course, tomorrow is Jers Day, which is always one of the most exciting days in Scottish news. But that is all we've got time for tonight. So thank you once again to Alan Smith MP and to Pinar Aksu. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great evening. Good night.